Needleford-on-Avon prided itself on being a town of proper natures and modest emergencies. Nothing loudly unfortunate was supposed to happen there. The butcher shut at 1, the chemist at 5:30, and the vicar's trousers had been mended by the same woman for 37 years without a single complaint or visible innovation. It was therefore felt to be deeply unsettling when at precisely 10 minutes past 4 on a Thursday afternoon, a length of scarlet silk was discovered dangling from the mayoral chair. This occurred in Needleford Hall, a building of civic ambition but architectural hesitation. It had once been a coaching inn of promise and had since become a meeting place for committees that disliked meetings. The parish council were assembling for their fortnightly deliberations, which mainly involved sitting in silence while shuffling papers that had never caused any living person distress. The scarlet thread was not subtle. It hung down from the carved oak arm of the chair, glistening faintly in the afternoon light, as though it had been placed there by someone who wished to make a point, but was too polite to attach a note. Mrs. Winifred Clout, Honorary Secretary of the Flower and Vegetable Committee, was the first to see it. She stared. In Needleford, staring was considered a form of investigation. "My word," she said quietly, which in Needleford was equivalent to an alarm bell. Councillor Arthur Blenkinsop, a man of administrative usefulness and facial dampness, leaned forward. He wore the troubled look of someone encountering colour outside accepted ranges. "Is that thread?" he asked. "It appears to be, intentional," Mrs. Clout replied. They advanced slowly as though expecting it to leap away. No one suggested removing it. Respectable objects, even suspicious ones, were seldom touched on impulse. By 4:25, the thread had acquired a small but committed audience. It dangled, it shimmered, it refused to explain itself. At 4:30, someone remembered Inspector Purbright. He arrived at 4:42, which was not hurry, but was considered good form. Inspector Purbright removed his hat in the doorway of Needleford Hall, not because there was a religious rule about such things, but because it gave people time to look at him before he spoke. He noticed the scent of furniture polish. He noticed the way Mrs. Clout's hands clasped each other as though attempting to apologize for events beyond her control. He noticed Councillor Blenkinsop's inability to stand where he had previously been sitting, and he noticed the thread without comment. "Good afternoon," Purbright said mildly. "You appear to be entertaining a textile." No one laughed, though several felt he might have made a joke. "Inspector," said Mrs. Clout, relieved by the arrival of grammar in uniform, "we found it hanging there, just so." "Was it so before?" he asked. No one was entirely certain. It was definitely not so, said Blenkinsop, which satisfied nobody. Purbright approached the chair, hands behind his back, head tilted slightly in the manner of a man examining a painting he had no intention of buying. The silk was a dark, rich scarlet, proper silk, the sort that passed through shops without lingering, but lingered in memory afterward. "Who sat here last?" Purbright asked. There was a ceremonial pause. The name hovered. Then Mrs. Clout said it. Miss Lillian Harcourt. The name fell rather flatly, which only increased its interest. Lillian Harcourt was Needleford's seamstress, a woman of discreet thimbles and stubborn hems. She had a small shop near the post office and a reputation for never discussing anything loudly, clearly, or in a way that could be proven. She was due to present a modest proposal for new curtains in the parish reading room. She had not arrived. "Was Miss Harcourt expected?" Purbright asked. "Oh, yes," said Mrs. Clout. "She's very punctual." Councillor Blenkinsop nodded, then hesitated, then nodded again. "She never misses things," he added, as though this made something else worse. Purbright did not touch the thread, he simply looked at it. He thought about how silk was seldom wasted. He thought about how bright colours had social consequences. And he thought about how Miss Harcourt had once hemmed the trousers of a man who now appeared to be breathing too quickly. The door of the hall opened quietly and closed again with unnecessary dignity. Outside, Needleford continued its business. A child dropped a sweet. A dog considered a lamppost at length. The chemist sighed experimentally. Inside, something had moved from the possible into the visible. Purbright straightened. "Well," he said pleasantly, "we shall have to ask one or two questions, I think." Softly. The scarlet thread trembled slightly in a draught no one remembered making. And Needleford, for the first time in many years, felt faintly observed. By 5 o'clock, Needleford had achieved its preferred condition of quiet agitation. The sort of agitation that took place behind curtains and among teacups, expressed not in alarm, but in the careful rearrangement of biscuits. The parish hall had been closed for airing, which was usually reserved for outbursts of emotion or the discovery of troublesome insects. The scarlet thread remained, but discussion of it had already outpaced any physical proximity to the object itself. At the corner of Bellwether Street, Mrs. Agnes Pike poured tea with the slow deliberation of a woman who suspected that urgency, like fashion, had been vastly overstated. "They say it was hanging from the mayor's chair," she murmured. "They who?" asked Mrs. Dallow, whose own identity was largely constructed from second-hand information. "People who happened," replied Mrs. Pike, which explained nothing and satisfied everything. The tea was weak, which was considered thoughtful. "They say Miss Harcourt never arrived," Mrs. Dallow added softly enough that she could later deny having said it. "Miss Harcourt has always arrived," Mrs. Pike said, even when she did not. Across town, Inspector Purbright walked without visible speed, which gave the impression that the town itself was moving to accommodate him. He passed the seamstress's shop. The curtains were drawn to the sensible halfway mark, allowing light in and discouraging interpretation. A small paper sign in the window read, "Back in 10 minutes." The ink looked older than the promise. Purbright paused, as a man might pause before knocking on a door he has no intention of knocking. He observed the neat scissors displayed in a porcelain cup. He observed the small pincushion shaped like a startled hen. He observed the floor, swept so carefully that it suggested slight anxiety. He made no note of these things except in the portion of his mind that prided itself on permanent tenancy. Behind him, 2 respectable women passed. "One mustn't say she's disappeared," said the first. "No," said the second. "Only that she has mistimed herself." Inside the police office, Sergeant Fletcher sat with his boots aligned like loyal dogs. "There's not been an actual crime," Fletcher said when Purbright returned. "Only fabric." "Fabric," said Purbright thoughtfully, "has a habit of forming patterns." Fletcher frowned, which was easier than agreeing. "There is talk," Fletcher said, lowering his voice in deference to the possibility that talk might hear him, "that Councillor Blenkinsop sat in that chair earlier to test the leg." Purbright sighed inwardly. "Did he find it wanting?" he asked. "He found it present," Fletcher replied. "But he says the chair was unattached." "Unattached?" Purbright repeated. "The thread wasn't there, sir." This, in Needleford, was considered progress. By 6:30, gossip had reached the railway buffet where men who had never entered Needleford Hall quietly improved the story. "A red rope, I heard," said one. "Silk sash," said another. "Blood, probably," said a third, who enjoyed health. Purbright walked past them, immune to enlargement. He turned, instead, towards Mrs. Clout's house. Mrs. Clout lived in a narrow terrace that smelled faintly of lavender and obsolete ambitions. She welcomed him with the careful relief of someone who had practiced being calm. "He didn't like the curtains," she said abruptly. "Who didn't?" Purbright asked gently. "Councillor Blenkinsop. His wife said the pattern was too suggestive." "Of what?" She hesitated. "Confidence," she said at last. This seemed quite serious. "Miss Harcourt was upset," Mrs. Clout continued. "Politely, very politely." "Did she say anything?" Purbright asked. "She said, 'One must never pull a thread in public.'" Purbright stored that away with unnecessary care. By 7, the town had decided that the thread was either an insult, a warning, or an artistic protest. No one suggested it might be accidental. At 7:15, Purbright returned once more to the parish hall. The building was locked, which suggested official discomfort rather than actual security. He looked through the high window. The scarlet thread still hung there, obedient and upright, as if waiting to be consulted. He could not see the knot. He did not need to. He walked on, considering Miss Harcourt's empty shop, the sign that did not mean what it said, and the curious way in which people spoke her name more softly than the vicar's. Behind a hedge, Mrs. Pike said to Mrs. Dallow, "Inspector's thinking." "That's dangerous," Mrs. Dallow replied. Inside a small upstairs room above the seamstress's shop, a light was turned off very carefully, as though darkness itself was something that needed handling. Purbright, on his way home, removed his hat one street too early. He considered the chair, the silk, and the word confidence. He considered how easily a town could be startled by colour, and he wondered for the first time who had last touched the thread before it touched them. The sound of a clock striking 8 travelled through Needleford with the self-conscious dignity of time announcing itself to those who pretended not to worry about it. Nothing else had happened, which, in Needleford, was how everything began. At 8:30, the town settled into its evening manner of restraint, which consisted largely of people sitting very still and thinking noisily. Lamps were lit with an air of responsibility, curtains drawn with moral purpose, and the occasional cough permitted to wander into the street, as though it might find something better to do there. Inspector Purbright did not return home. He walked instead in the direction of the river path, where the gravel preserved the confessions of shoes and the trees retained a useful talent for silence. The air smelt faintly of damp stone and boiled cabbage. Both had their place. Miss Marjorie Tolland was standing by the iron footbridge, engaged in what she liked to call thought, but which most people would have described as uninterrupted looking. She was a woman of excellent posture and questionable loyalty to other people's privacy. When she saw Purbright, she arranged her face into a shape that suggested dignity had just occurred to her. "Inspector," she said carefully. "Out late?" "I find the town more honest after dark," Purbright replied. "People are too tired to decorate their thoughts." She absorbed this with visible effort. "You'll be wanting to know who last used the corridor by the council chamber," she said. "I should dislike to trouble you," he answered. "Nonsense," she said, immediately troubled. "I was dusting the notice board." "At precisely what time?" he asked. "About 4, she said, and then added, "Before." "Before what?" "Before the thread." But this was something like a statement. She folded her arms as if holding in a thought that lacked suitable manners. "I saw Miss Harcourt," she went on, "standing by the side door." "Did she enter the hall?" Purbright asked. "No," Miss Tolland said. "She looked as if she meant to, and then decided against being meant." "And then?" "And then Councillor Blenkinsop came out." "How did they greet one another?" Purbright asked. "They did not," she said promptly. "They stood. They did what people do when they are very aware." There was a pause in which the river took a long time to pass a short distance. She looked at him, Miss Tolland continued. Longer than a look ought to last. And he? Said Purbright. He adjusted his cuffs, she said, repeatedly. This seemed important, though it gave no help. Miss Tolland leaned closer. She dropped something, she said. Miss Harcourt? Purbright asked. Yes. What was it? Miss Tolland frowned, which suggested that memory had entered a social negotiation. A bit of ribbon, she said. Not red, not scarlet, a sort of dull claret, like something that had once been proud. Did Councillor Blenkinsop notice? He noticed everything, she said. That's why he looked foolish. And what became of the ribbon? Purbright asked. He picked it up, she said. Then he put it in his pocket. Then he looked as though he had swallowed a small bone. This information sat down between them and required attention. So, Purbright said gently, you watched all this. I look carefully, Miss Tolland said. Someone must. Purbright walked on afterwards, allowing the night to place itself in modest layers. He thought of the ribbon, now contained in a councillor's pocket, like a suppressed remark. He thought of the look that had lasted too long, and of the way people changed their hands when they had nowhere respectable to stand. By 9 the town windows had grown eyes. In the tobacconists 2 men discussed the matter without names, which was the local method of precision. She's probably gone to see her sister, one said. She hasn't got a sister, said the other. No one has these days. Purbright did not join them. He walked back towards Miss Harcourt's shop. The upstairs window was dark. The downstairs curtains remained half-drawn, in their usual attitude of polite refusal. He tried the door. It was locked, but in the manner of someone who had locked it twice, and then put a chair against their own thoughts. Behind the glass he saw the scissors, the hen-shaped pincushion, the neat, frightened floor, and something else. A ripple in the curtain, as if the air had touched it and been told to be careful. He stepped back. Somewhere a clock moved towards 9:30 in the way clocks do when they are proud of themselves. On the far side of the square, Councillor Blenkinsop closed his front door with more sound than was necessary. In his sitting room he removed an object from his coat pocket and placed it, very carefully, inside the second drawer of a small writing table. The ribbon lay there without comment. It was not scarlet. It was not silk. It was, however, a thread that had begun to tug. Back by the river, Miss Tolland remained on the bridge, enjoying the feeling of having invested in knowledge. Purbright turned into a side street that smelt of damp stone and respectable boredom. He looked up once at a house where a lace curtain had been moved back an inch too far. He saw the movement. He did not react. A town was never so articulate as when it thought no one was listening. By 10, a thin rain had begun to arrange itself neatly along the roof lines, as if the sky had become as self-conscious as everyone else. Purbright slowed his step. He now knew that Miss Harcourt had not simply failed to arrive. He knew she had been present. He knew there had been a ribbon. He knew it was not where it began. He did not yet know where it ended. The town, meanwhile, slept with the quiet confidence of people who assumed that silence was proof of innocence. By morning, the rain had washed Needleford into a condition of renewed propriety. The cobbles shone, the hedges looked disciplined, and the chimneys gave off a dependable smoke that suggested breakfast had been confronted and won. The town, which had felt watched the night before, now felt quietly judged. Inspector Purbright arrived at the police office at 8:30, which was early enough to cause Sergeant Fletcher to feel both respect and mild alarm. "Any developments?" Fletcher asked, in a tone suggesting he hoped there had been none. "Several," Purbright replied, all extremely small. He hung up his hat with the patient precision of a man setting down a thought. Councillor Arthur Blenkinsop arrived at 10. He did not hurry. He never had. Hurry suggested instability, and Councillor Blenkinsop had built his entire public character upon the avoidance of instability, except in small, useful doses. He was a neat man, neat hair, neat cuffs, neat opinions. Even his unease was arranged in tidy portions. "Inspector," he said, shaking hands with a firmness that arrived half a second too late. "Councillor," Purbright said pleasantly, "do sit down." Blenkinsop sat, though he did not appear to trust the chair. "I understand you were in the parish hall shortly before the discovery," Purbright said. Blenkinsop adjusted his cuffs. "I merely tested the chair leg," he said. "A question of safety." "A question of safety is frequently sound," Purbright agreed. "Only for a moment," Blenkinsop added. Purbright folded his hands and waited. It was surprising how often people filled silence with truth simply because it was empty. "I did not see any thread," Blenkinsop said. "I did not ask," Purbright replied. This made a small dent. "You did meet Miss Harcourt?" Purbright continued mildly. No, Blenkinsop said quickly, then caught himself. "Well, I passed her." "Where?" "By the side corridor," he said. "She was standing." "Standing is popular," Purbright observed. Blenkinsop smiled faintly, which did nothing to improve the atmosphere. "She looked preoccupied," he said. "And you?" Purbright asked. "I was adjusting my cuffs," he said, before appearing to remember he had already said this. Purbright inclined his head. "Did Miss Harcourt drop anything?" he asked, as if the question had just occurred to him. Blenkinsop's eyes performed a small, rapid rearrangement. "I don't recall," he said. "These things are easily forgotten." "Of course," Purbright said. "It is difficult to remember what one has not noticed." A pause. "Did you pick anything up from the floor?" Purbright added. "No." This answer was too clean. Purbright made no comment. "I understand," he said. There was some difference of opinion regarding the new curtains for the reading room. Blenkinsop stiffened. "They were unnecessarily bright," he said. "Bright?" "Expressive," Blenkinsop said. "People don't come to read amidst statements." Purbright nodded. "Did Miss Harcourt object?" "She was polite," Blenkinsop said. "Excessively polite. One doesn't know where one stands with someone so polite." In the small silence that followed, some honesty tried unsuccessfully to escape. Outside, Mrs. Pike passed the window and observed the councillor's hat on the peg, which was immediately considered important. Inside, Purbright asked, "Would you describe your memory as reliable?" "In administrative matters," Blenkinsop said proudly. "And in matters of cloth?" Purbright asked. The smile failed. "I am not a fabric man," Blenkinsop said. "Yet you felt able to judge Miss Harcourt's work," Purbright said. "I have eyes." "So do most things," Purbright replied. The councillor shifted in his chair. "I am certain this will be found to be a misunderstanding," he said. "Needleford is not a place for dramas." Purbright thought of the scarlet thread trembling slightly in the empty hall. "That is often its chief difficulty," he said. When Blenkinsop had gone, he left behind a faint smell of starch and suggestion. Purbright remained seated, thinking of pockets and drawers, of ribbons dulled by disappointment, and of the peculiar way people forgot what they had gone to the trouble of hiding. By midday, the town had rebuilt its confidence to a measurable degree. Men stood outside the butcher's, speaking of weather. Women placed letters into the post-box with unnecessary gentleness. The baker's girl dropped a loaf and picked it up quickly, as if speed might prevent meaning. Purbright walked past the Seamstress's shop again. The sign still read, "Back in 10 minutes." The minutes were now approaching disgrace. He lingered in the quiet street and imagined Miss Harcourt standing by the side corridor, not entering, not leaving, choosing something that required time. Behind him, a curtain moved and then stilled. In the quiet of his own office, Blenkinsop sat very upright and opened the second drawer. The dull claret ribbon lay coiled like a thought he dared not finish. He did not touch it. He simply looked at it and tried to forget the way Miss Harcourt had looked at him, with politeness that had lasted just a fraction too long. Back in the streets, Purbright lifted his eyes to the grey, steady sky. He did not yet know where Miss Harcourt had gone, but he knew now that not looking was as valuable as looking. He began to suspect that the town itself had started to unravel, one careful fibre at a time. By mid-afternoon, the light had developed the thin, apologetic quality which Needleford associated with private thinking. The rain had stopped, leaving the pavements with the faint, embarrassed shine of surfaces that had revealed too much. A bus passed without conviction. Somewhere a dog barked once and immediately regretted it. Inspector Purbright stood before the locked door of Miss Harcourt's shop for the third time that day, which was the limit at which a man might be said to have a reason. He tried the handle again, not with hope, but with a quiet courtesy usually reserved for acquaintances. Inside, nothing moved. Outside, Mrs. Pike moved. "You're very patient," she said, appearing beside him with the studied accident of a woman who knew exactly where to be. "I find doors rarely respond to emotion," Purbright replied. "Have you seen Miss Harcourt today?" "No," said Mrs. Pike. "Not today." "Yesterday?" "I might have," she said. "One sees many backs." "Was hers distinctive?" he asked. "She walked as if the ground had feelings," Mrs. Pike said, and seemed quite satisfied with this. He inclined his head as though the paving stones might now require apology. "A little late she was," Mrs. Pike added. "Not wrong late, thoughtful late." "She was carrying anything?" Purbright asked. Mrs. Pike hesitated. "She had a parcel," she said. "A long one, wrapped plain, which is never plain at all." "Did she go towards the post office?" he asked. "Past it," said Mrs. Pike. "One does not pass the post office without meaning to." That seemed likely. By 3 o'clock, with the locksmith located and gently bribed by the promise of useful delay, the door to the seamstress's shop opened with a sigh that suggested mild relief. The room held its breath. The small porcelain cup still cradled its scissors, though one pair now appeared oddly absent, like a tooth a person had learned not to mention. The hen-shaped pincushion remained on the counter, pins set in a careful pattern that had the quietness of rehearsal. There was no disorder, there was, however, absence. Purbright walked slowly, hands behind his back. On the wall hung a small shelf of threads, each wound with modest pride. Scarlet appeared only in the bottom row, and in a quantity too small to be wasted. On the work-table lay a length of dull, pale cloth, half-hemmed and abandoned in mid-courtesy. The floor had been swept with a thoroughness that was now suspicious. In the back room, a shallow drawer stood ajar, empty. "This is where she kept the cutting tools," Fletcher said quietly from the doorway. "She showed me once when she fixed my wife's coat." "She kept them in a drawer?" Purbright asked. "Very careful," Fletcher said. Purbright nodded. Carefully missing things tended to be more important than carelessly present ones. By 4, a small group had gathered outside the shop, pretending to discuss weather. "She's probably visiting relations," someone said. "She doesn't have relations," another replied. "She could have started," said a third, and was immediately shunned for impractical optimism. Purbright walked towards the rear of the building, where a narrow alley slipped past the back wall and pretended to be a destination. It smelled faintly of coal sacks and discouraged ambition. There, beneath a low, splintered fence, he saw the mark of a long object having been rested against it. The wood was scraped, faintly indented, as if something wrapped had leaned there and thought better of falling. A fragment of paper, damp and obedient, lay curled near the drain. He picked it up without hurry. It was not addressed. It read, in careful hand, "Do not forget what was promised." He folded it slowly. At 5, back in the station, Fletcher placed the empty scissor drawer on the desk as though it might say something if threatened. "That drawer hasn't been forced," Fletcher said. "No," Purbright said. "It has been respected." "At some point she opened it," Fletcher said. "Yes," said Purbright, "or someone to whom it belonged." By 6, the town had added theft to its collection of feared words, though it was careful to say it softly so as not to wake it. In his sitting room, Councillor Blenkinsop opened the second drawer and stared at the ribbon. He then looked at his coat hanging on the chair. The pocket bulged faintly. He did not touch it. Across the square, Miss Tollin stood at her upstairs window and wrote a list of things she had seen and people she no longer trusted. At 7, Purbright returned to the seamstress's shop. The light in the front room was thin. The scissors cup was still incomplete. He looked at the shelf of threads again, and this time counted them. There was space where something else had been. Not Scarlet. Something quieter. He closed his eyes briefly and considered rain, parcels, long-wrapped shapes, and promises remembered only when they were breaking. Behind the shop, the alley, listened, which alleys often do without acknowledgement. By 8, the post office had closed, and the parcels it had never received sat in invisible places, accumulating meaning. Purbright walked slowly through the square, passing faces that looked forward and thoughts that looked sideways. He now knew that something had been taken. He knew that something had been carried. He knew that the absence of scissors mattered far more than the presence of silk. He did not yet know what had been cut. But he felt very clearly that a line had been drawn and that Needleford had stepped over it without noticing. By the following morning, Needleford had reached the stage of disturbance it found most comfortable, which was to say disturbance that could be discussed without being admitted. The postman delivered letters with an air of tolerance. The grocer weighed flour as though careful measurements might restore moral balance. Even the clock over the chemist's shop seemed to hesitate slightly before striking, as if uncertain whether time ought to continue in such circumstances. Inspector Purbright walked early, not because of urgency, but because the streets were at their most honest when recently washed and not yet touched by opinion. He passed the seamstress's shop, whose windows now had the defeated look of eyes that had blinked too late. The sign still promised her return. The promise had begun to feel sarcastic. He turned toward the small stationer's where Mrs. Hargreaves kept ledgers that had never overcharged because she had never dared. She looked up as he entered and smiled with the politeness of a woman prepared to give nothing away unless asked in the correct tone. "Inspector," she said. "You're early." "Only by the town's standards," Purbright replied. "Do you keep records of parcels sent from Needleford?" "I keep records of everything," she said, with modest satisfaction. "But mostly of what I'm allowed to see." He leaned slightly on the counter, which encouraged confession by imitation of intimacy. "Has anyone posted a long parcel recently?" he asked. Wrapped plainly. She adjusted her spectacles, which were not required but were appropriate. "There was one," she said, "yesterday afternoon." "Addressed?" Purbright asked. She hesitated, then looked down, which was her way of looking back. "No," she said. "It was collected." "By whom?" "A man," she said. "A careful man. He didn't want a receipt." "That seems decisive," Purbright said. "He paid in exact change," she added, with visible dislike. "Did he say anything?" "Yes," she said. "He said, 'It is better if no one remembers this.' Do you remember him?" "Perfectly," she said. "I would not trust a man who trusts exact change." Outside, a tram passed, though it went nowhere useful. Purbright walked on, letting the information settle like dust on a curtsied surface. A private collection. A careful man, a sentence that sounded as if it had been practiced. By late morning, he was walking the long way round toward the vicarage, where the Reverend Pettigrew engaged with the moral health of the town by trying to avoid understanding it. The vicar greeted him with the gentle alarm of a man who associated police with paperwork and silence with grace. "Inspector," he said, "a strange business." "Indeed," Purbright replied. "I wondered if Miss Harcourt had mentioned anything particular to you in recent weeks." "She spoke once," Pettigrew said, "about patterns." "Patterns?" "She said that when people alter things quietly, they believe they are safe," the vicar said. "She said, but cloth remembers where it was cut." "And what did you think?" Purbright asked. "I thought she might be referring to hemming," the vicar said. "One rarely thinks of more." Afterwards, Purbright walked past the river again, which had returned to its usual occupation of moving everything away from itself. On the bridge stood Miss Tolland, who was dressed as though preparing to be remembered. "You're late," she said. "I am punctual," he replied. "The town is slow." "I saw something else," she said. "Yes," Purbright said gently. "You did." "It was a man at the back of the shop," she said, "last night, after dark." "What sort of man?" he asked. "The sort who believes he is not a man if he is seen," she said. "He walked as though the stones were watching." "Did he carry anything?" Purbright asked. "He carried something long," she said, "and wrapped." "Did he look like Councillor Blenkinsop?" She considered. "No," she said. "This man didn't fear himself." That, somehow, seemed important. At midday, a committee gathered in Needleford Hall to discuss the matter of replacing the lock, which they treated as a philosophical problem. The scarlet thread had been removed, not ceremonially, but with the air of one lifting a delicate embarrassment and placing it behind a lid. Purbright saw the chair once more. The carved arm looked faintly paler where the silk had rested, like wood remembering colour. "You have removed the thread," he said to Mrs. Clout. "Yes," she said. "It felt indecent to leave it." "Where did you put it?" he asked. She hesitated. "In a drawer," she said. "The second one." At 3 he returned to his office and considered drawers, pockets, parcels, and the similarity between men who hid things and women who prevented them from disappearing entirely. Sergeant Fletcher entered quietly. "Inspector," he said, "there's talk of a quarrel." "Between whom?" Purbright asked. "Miss Harcourt and a gentleman who used to live 2 streets from her," Fletcher said. "Name of Mr. Dalrymple." "What kind of quarrel?" "Quiet," Fletcher said, "the dangerous kind." "Where is Mr. Dalrymple?" Purbright asked. "Moved away last month," Fletcher said. "No forwarding address, only left a note saying, 'One must not stay where one has been measured.'" Purbright thought of cutting tools, of careful men, of patterns that did not match. By late afternoon the light began to thin again, and the town began once more to settle into its habit of pretending. In his sitting room, Councillor Blenkinsop finally reached into his coat pocket. His fingers touched paper. He withdrew it and unfolded it slowly. "Do not forget what was promised," it said. His mouth dried, which had been happening rather often. He placed the note in the second drawer beside the ribbon and closed it with the care of a man closing a thought before it was complete. Back in the street, Miss Tolland watched a stranger walk away from the seamstress's shop, though she told no one because sometimes knowledge required a little patience. By evening, Purbright stood alone on the bridge. The river moved, the lamps came on, which was both comforting and revealing. He now knew that the parcel had not been sent, but collected. He knew the thread had been moved, not lost. He knew a careful man had chosen silence as a method of transport. He knew Miss Harcourt had been interfering with patterns that were not cloth. And he knew that the next piece of this small, delicate unravelment would not be found by searching for what was missing, but by noticing what did not belong. The town, meanwhile, busied itself with ordinary matters, which was how it liked to hide extraordinary ones. The morning arrived in Needleford with the faint hesitation of someone approaching a difficult conversation. Mist lay in the low places, not thick enough to hide, only heavy enough to soften truths. The town accepted the light as it always did, carefully and without enthusiasm, as though brightness were a thing that should be rationed. Inspector Purbright began the day by walking, because walking allowed thoughts to arrange themselves without interruption. He passed the chemist, where the clock now struck confidently again, and the baker's, where loaves sat in obedient rows, untroubled by philosophy. He went, as drawn by a logic too polite to be called instinct, to Needleford Hall. Inside, the hall smelled of polish and mild regret. The long table stood ready for meetings that would avoid conclusions. The mayoral chair remained in its place, slightly cleaner than the rest of the furniture, which was itself a kind of confession. Mrs. Clout was alone, dusting a surface that had not been touched overnight. "Good morning, Inspector," she said, in the manner of someone greeting the weather. "Good morning," he replied. "I wondered if I might see the drawer." Her duster paused mid-air. "The drawer? You mentioned it yesterday," he said gently. "The second one?" She set the duster down slowly, like a woman placing down something that had unexpectedly become heavy. "This way," she said. In a side room that smelled faintly of old paper and newer fear, she produced a small cabinet. It was oak and polished, and had clearly been treated kindly in order to discourage it from saying too much. She opened the second drawer. Inside lay the scarlet thread, not coiled, not folded, simply placed there as if it had been put to bed by someone who had briefly considered singing to it. Purbright leaned forward slightly. He did not touch it. "It was longer," Mrs. Clout said, without being asked. "How long?" he said. She gestured with her fingers. "Long enough to be deliberate," she said. "Who else knows it is here?" he asked. "Nobody," she said promptly. "I've been very proper about it." "Have you looked at it often?" he asked. "Only when I couldn't help it," she said. "That is to say, quite frequently." Purbright nodded. "Thank you," he said. He left the hall and stepped back into the air that smelt of damp stone and reluctant sunshine. He went next to the police office, where Sergeant Fletcher had arranged his paperwork into lines of well-behaved rectangles. "I'd like to see Councillor Blenkinsop's house," Purbright said. Fletcher blinked. "Officially?" he asked. "Politely," Purbright replied. The house sat slightly apart from its neighbours, as if it had been designed by a man who feared being overheard by brick. The curtains were arranged with careful modesty, suggesting habits that had long outlived their reasons. Blenkinsop answered the door with the startled dignity of a man who had been practising calm and had forgotten to put it away. "Inspector," he said, with the voice of someone being unexpectedly tested. "May I come in?" Purbright asked. "I suppose so," Blenkinsop said, which meant no. They sat in a room of careful furniture and cautious ornaments. Everything had been placed with a view to permanence. Nothing looked moved. That too seemed deliberate. "I was thinking about drawers," Purbright said conversationally. Blenkinsop's smile became theoretical. "Drawers," he repeated. "Yes," Purbright said. "Second drawers in particular." "You'd find them in most tables," Blenkinsop said. "Entirely ordinary." "I quite agree," Purbright said. There was a moment in which nothing happened, and in Needleford this was a recognized form of pressure. Blenkinsop rose as if on a thought he could not admit. "May I offer you tea?" he asked. "No," Purbright said, "but I would be grateful to see your writing table." Another pause. "That seems unnecessary," Blenkinsop said. "Probably," Purbright replied. They moved finally, not as agreement, but as progression. The writing table stood by the wall, bland, domestic, containing secrets in quantities considered safe by men who liked to pretend they had none. Blenkinsop opened the first drawer, containing twine, a broken pencil, and a folded program of a church social. "Second," Purbright said mildly. He hesitated, very slightly. Then he opened it. The ribbon lay there, not bright, not proud, dull claret. Beside it lay the folded note. Purbright neither smiled nor frowned. "May I?" he asked. Blenkinsop stepped back, which was a kind of answer. Purbright lifted the note, unfolded it, read it, and set it back down gently, as one replaces a thought to avoid frightening it. "Do you recognize the handwriting?" he asked. Blenkinsop's mouth worked, though sound did not. I once," he began, and stopped. "Yes," Purbright said. They returned to the sitting room with the quiet dignity of men who had both lost something and found something else. "You didn't force me," Blenkinsop said, as though this troubled him. "I rarely force," Purbright said. "I notice." By midday, the town had produced a new layer of narrative which suggested that Miss Harcourt had been in delicate condition, therefore capable of any degree of unpredictability. This theory had the advantage of requiring no evidence and offered the comfort of moral distance. Purbright dismissed it with silent politeness. He walked again past the seamstress's shop. The door remained locked. The windows stared outward, now no longer feigning expectation. At the back of the building, he crouched, awkwardly, which was rare, and examined the ground near the fence. The earth had been disturbed, not enough for burial, but enough for decision. Something had been dragged, not carried, dragged. A long, wrapped shape had resisted being tidy. He stood slowly. From an upstairs window, Miss Tolland watched him notice what she had not thought to see. By late afternoon, the air began again to thin, and with it, the town's composure. Purbright sat alone in his office and arranged the facts without writing them down. A man who collected parcels, a ribbon hidden but not discarded, a note that had travelled between hands like a thought too dangerous to own, a thread that had been placed, moved, and concealed, and somewhere in Needleford a woman who had chosen absence over endurance. At 6 o'clock Sergeant Fletcher returned. "Inspector," he said, "I spoke to the railway porter." "Yes," Purbright said. "He remembers a woman yesterday," Fletcher said, "carrying a long parcel, plain. He helped her lift it." "Where did she go?" Purbright asked. "She didn't," Fletcher said. "She waited." "For what?" "For a man." Purbright looked at the window where the sky had darkened with unnecessary politeness. "And the man?" he asked. Fletcher swallowed. "He matched the stationer's description," he said. "Careful. Exact change. Didn't like receipts." Outside, a car passed very slowly, as if each brick deserved to be considered separately. By evening, Purbright walked back through the square, the lamplight now casting long shadows that emphasized the wrong things. He felt the town beginning to close in on its own secret, not with speed, but with the careful compression of embarrassment. He did not yet know where Miss Harcourt was, but he now knew she had intended to confront something heavier than herself, and he knew that the second drawer in more houses than one had become the proper resting place of truths that could not yet be spoken. The lamps burned steadily as he walked on. Behind one curtain, a hand rested on a drawer handle and did not open it, which was, that night, the bravest thing that happened in Needleford. The morning was cool enough to make the teacups feel significant. Needleford woke with the sort of energy that belonged to respectable uncertainty. Windows were opened with moral caution. Doorsteps were swept with a thoroughness that suggested memory might be disturbed by dust. Inspector Purbright found himself thinking not of crimes but of habits, which were often more revealing. He walked slowly through the square, observing the way curtains were drawn back just far enough to allow suspicion, and no farther. He noted the doors that opened too quickly, and those that did not open at all. At the station, he sat alone for a time, hands folded, considering how people handled objects in their homes when no one was watching. He thought of the way Blenkinsop had opened his drawers in order, as though drawing attention to the first might somehow cleanse the second. He thought of Mrs. Clout placing the scarlet thread in a drawer as one might place a difficult thought into storage, hoping it would not mature. Domestic life, he reflected, was mostly about the acceptable concealment of movement. He rose and went to the row of small houses near the baker's, where Miss Harcourt had once been seen buying pins in silence. He knocked at the door of a narrow lodging-house kept by Mrs. Hemsley, a woman whose joy came from controlling keys. "You'll want to know if she came here," Mrs. Hemsley said at once, which saved time. "Did she?" Purbright asked. She leaned in slightly and lowered her voice to a pitch that was considered truthful. "She did," she said. "2 nights ago." "At what hour?" he asked. "Not late," she said. "Not early, a wrong sort of in-between." "Did she stay?" Purbright asked. "No," Mrs. Hemsley said. "She sat in the hallway." "Did she bring anything with her?" he asked. "A parcel," Mrs. Hemsley said. Long, wrapped, she rested it against the umbrella stand as though it had offended her. "Did she say anything?" Purbright asked. "She said, 'I don't know how to give this to the right person,'" Mrs. Hemsley replied. Then she picked it up again and carried it out as though the floor had betrayed her. Outside, a milk cart passed, the bottles protesting quietly against their fate. Purbright walked on, thinking of umbrella stands and offended parcels. At the seamstress's shop he paused, not to demand entry, but to watch the building do nothing. A cat crossed the step delicately, avoiding the place where the scraper had once been. Behind him, Miss Tolland's voice appeared. "People are acting strangely," she said. "They very often do," he replied. "There was a light upstairs last night," she said. "At what time?" Purbright asked. "Late," she said. "The honest kind of late." "Did you see anyone?" "I saw the curtain," she said. "It moved without being touched." Purbright nodded, which seemed sufficient. By noon he returned to his rooms and made tea, which was unnecessary but civil. He watched the surface settle, which always did if left alone long enough. He thought of Miss Harcourt as a woman who folded cloth for a living, and secrets by necessity. He thought of how she had delayed entry to the hall that afternoon, as though weighing the cost of being seen. He thought of Mrs. Pike's description of her walking, as if the ground had feelings. There were patterns in that. In the afternoon he walked to the small row of cottages near the canal where Mr. Dalrymple had once lived. The new tenant was a young clerk who had not yet learned to lie convincingly. "Did you find anything when you moved in?" Purbright asked. The clerk hesitated. "There was a board loose under the hearth," he said. "And underneath?" Purbright asked. "Nothing," the clerk said. Purbright waited. "Nothing of value," the clerk corrected. "Only old paper." "What did you do with it?" "I burned it," the clerk said. "It smelled of thread and dust." Purbright nodded. Paper, he thought, rarely smelt of thread unless it had been wrapped around something. By late afternoon he found himself in the tea room by the post office, where the tables were small and the conversations large. Mrs. Pike was there, as arranged by habit rather than design. "She would not leave her scissors behind," Mrs. Pike said, without being asked. "No," Purbright agreed. "She would not leave her best ones," Mrs. Pike added. "Only the ordinary." "And she did leave some?" he asked. "Yes," Mrs. Pike said. "She left the ones that cut for other people." The thought sat with him. At 5, he walked once more past Blenkinsop's house. The curtains were fully drawn now, which suggested the man inside had drawn his own conclusions and found them untidy. Purbright did not knock. Inside, Blenkinsop sat staring at the second drawer, his hand hovering above the handle as though it might burn him. At 6, Fletcher brought word. "Railway porter says the careful man came back again," he said. "Did he ask for the parcel?" Purbright asked. "He asked if it had been forgotten," Fletcher said. "And was it?" Purbright asked. The porter had shaken his head. "No one forgets what they're afraid of," Fletcher said. As evening approached, the shadows in Needleford lengthened with exaggerated delicacy. Lamps were lit earlier than necessary. Doors were locked twice, then once more for conscience. Purbright walked the river path alone, thinking not of missing persons, but of misplaced trust, of how objects moved through houses as people did, with permission when possible and force when not. He now knew Miss Harcourt had not vanished in fear. She had vanished in decision, and he began to understand that what she had tried to deliver was not cloth, nor tools, nor silk, but something heavier, knowledge sewn together from years of small observations. The town, behind its doors and lace curtains, practiced innocence with increasing care. Purbright stopped on the bridge and rested his hand lightly on the iron rail. He was very close now to the shape of the truth. He still refused to hurry it. The afternoon declared itself with the kind of light that made even innocent things look complicit. Needleford responded by adjusting its posture. Doors were closed with care, kettles filled with intent, and voices arranged into shapes that would not attract inquiry. It was the sort of day on which the town believed itself to be behaving naturally, which was almost always when it was least convincing. Inspector Purbright entered the tea-room at 3 minutes past 4, which was considered socially delicate, as 4 o'clock tea was not meant to be interrupted by strangers in possession of thought. The room smelled of warm china and old restraint. The tables were occupied by women whose hands rested upon their saucers as though the crockery required supervision. Mrs. Pike saw him immediately, because she had been waiting to see him without admitting it. "Tea, Inspector?" she asked. "If it is not too late," he replied. "It is entirely too late," she said, pouring anyway. He sat at the small table near the wall where conversations passed him like small animals attempting dignity. "You are looking for her," Mrs. Pike said. "I am thinking about her," Purbright replied. "There is a difference." Mrs. Pike stirred sugar into her cup with violence disguised as patience. "She was afraid," she said. "She was careful," Purbright corrected gently. "They look the same from behind curtains," Mrs. Pike said. "People think fear is loud. It is not." Purbright watched the steam appear and vanish. "I think she trusted the wrong person," Mrs. Pike added. He did not reply, which, in Needleford, was an invitation to continue. She trusted a man who folded things, Mrs. Pike said. Folded? Purbright asked. She said to me once, "There is a man in this town who folds things that should not be folded," Mrs. Pike said. I asked her if she meant laundry. And did she? Purbright asked. She said no, Mrs. Pike said. She said it was accounts. This sat in the air between them like a crumb that had fallen onto a polished table. Outside, Councillor Blenkinsop walked past the tea-room without looking in. He had developed the habit of not looking in. Inside his house, the second drawer remained closed. By 4:30, Purbright stood once more outside the seamstress's shop, feeling the peculiar pressure of a locked door that had learned too much. The glass reflected the street back to itself, which was comforting to the buildings, but not to him. Miss Tolland appeared at his side as if summoned by the shape of his shadow. "There will be a meeting tonight," she said. "A public one?" he asked. "No," she said. "The quiet kind?" "Where?" Purbright asked. "At the old grain warehouse by the canal," she said. "Men have been going in twos." "Did you see who?" he asked. "I saw who thought they were unseen," she said. "That is usually more important." By 5, the sky had begun to collect itself into an arrangement of grey that suggested preparation rather than weather. The air smelt of coal smoke and cautious expectations. Purbright walked along the canal path, boots measuring gravel that had been walked by people with better excuses than he possessed. The warehouses stood like old men who had outlived their usefulness and resented it. At the third building, a faint line of light escaped through a badly fitted board. He did not enter. He stood to one side and listened. Inside, voices, men's voices, low, ordinary, careful. "She knew too much," one said. "Only asked questions," another replied. "It was just to frighten her," a third added. A pause. "We didn't mean to," the first voice said. Purbright thought of scissors. He thought of long parcels. He thought of promises written on paper that smelt of fear. From within came the sound of a cup being set down. Tea, he realized, at the wrong hour. By 6, the meeting had dissolved, as such meetings always did, with awkwardness and the sudden awareness of being tired. The door of the warehouse opened, and 3 men left, each of them assuming that Shadow was a kind of ally. Purbright recognized none of them. That, too, seemed deliberate. He stepped away before they could see him, not looking. By evening, Needleford had reached the point of discomfort, at which it usually lit an extra lamp and called it civility. Blenkinsop sat in his sitting room with his hands folded, and the drawer still closed. He had become careful not only of objects, but of himself. "If I never open it," he murmured to the wall, "it cannot accuse me." The wall, which had heard many such plans, remained quiet. At the back of the seamstress's shop, a small sound disturbed the alley. A cat slipped past the fence, disturbed a piece of loose rubbish, and vanished into the uncertain dark. In the disturbed earth, a faint glint of metal caught the lamplight. No one noticed. Purbright returned home later than usual. He did not light the larger lamp, preferring the smaller one that admitted uncertainty. He poured himself a cup of tea and did not drink it. He considered the careful man, the parcel, the men in the warehouse who had brought their own cups as if ritual could excuse them. He began to see how Miss Harcourt's knowledge might have grown, not from one act, but from years of looking too closely at hems that did not align. He could now almost see her standing in the hallway of Mrs. Hemsley's house, parcel leaning against the umbrella stand, deciding whether truth could be handed over like luggage. By 10 o'clock, the town had fitted itself back into its normal shape, which was slightly less convincing than before. Curtains closed, clock struck. Someone coughed carefully. Purbright stood by his window and looked out at the street that had seen everything and said nothing. He was close enough now to hear the truth breathe. He was close enough to feel its reluctance. Tomorrow, he thought, he would not ask questions. He would offer an opportunity. And the town, with all its habits, would be forced to make a choice it disliked very much. The morning arrived without enthusiasm, which is to say, it arrived in Needleford's preferred manner. The light crept rather than shone. Doors were opened with care. Kettles were filled with the deliberate movements of people who were preparing not for tea, but for explanation. Inspector Purbright did not go first to the station. He went, as he often did when matters became delicate, to the river bridge. The water passed beneath with its usual refusal to become involved. He watched it for several minutes, not because it would tell him anything, but because still moving things could sometimes make stationary ones confess. By 10 o'clock he had sent polite messages, not orders, not summonses, messages, invitations wrapped in the sort of civility that implied refusal would be awkward. They gathered not at the police office and not at Needleford Hall, but in the small reading room off the square, where the air smelled faintly of dust and respectable endings. Mrs. Clout arrived first. Councillor Blenkinsop arrived last, as men often did, who feared that chronology itself might be evidence. Miss Tolland sat near the window, pretending not to lean forward. Sergeant Fletcher stood near the door, not to block it, but to feel useful. Purbright stood by the long table and waited until the room had assembled itself into quiet discomfort. "Thank you for coming," he said softly. "There is no urgency, only clarity." This seemed to worsen things. "I have been thinking about habits," he said. "Not crimes, not offences, habits." Mrs. Clout folded her hands. "Needleford," Purbright continued, "is a town fond of drawers." A faint ripple of unease moved around the room. "Things go into drawers," he said. "Things are placed there, things are hidden there, and sometimes things are protected there." Councillor Blenkinsop shifted. "I am going to tell you a small story," Purbright said. "Not a dramatic one. Needleford would not like that." He paused, not for effect, but for accuracy. "Some years ago," he said, "a careful arrangement was made, not in anger, but in practicality. A few men decided that certain accounts should be adjusted. No one lost much, no one gained much, but it was understood that quietness was valuable." The men in the room did not look at one another. They did not need to. "Miss Harcourt," Purbright went on, "was not involved. She was simply observant. She sewed, she hemmed, she listened. People speak more freely when their trousers are being altered." There was a faint sound as someone swallowed. "She noticed patterns," Purbright said, "irregular ones, payments that did not match receipts, men who came to her with cuffs that trembled when they spoke of the council's figures." Mrs. Pike, seated quietly at the back, lifted her chin slightly. "She began to write some of these matters down," he said, "not to expose, not to threaten, but to understand." He folded his hands. "She trusted the wrong man." This moved plainly through the room. "Mr. Dalrymple," he said gently, "who did not leave town for new opportunities, who left because he had been measured and found wanting." Miss Tolland's eyes widened, just enough to be noticed by herself. "He found her notes," Purbright said. "Not all. Enough. He told others." No one asked who. "They decided," Purbright said, "she should be frightened." A pause. "They did not decide she should be killed." The word lay in the room like a guest no one had invited. "She was lured," Purbright said, "not with force, with politeness, with suggestion. She was taken to the warehouse by the canal, where men who drink tea at the wrong hours like to reassure themselves." Blenkinsop's hands tightened in his lap. "They meant to scare her," Purbright said. "They meant to let her go shaken and silent and grateful." He lifted his eyes. She struck back. Silence did not respond. She had brought her best scissors, Purbright said. She had wrapped them. She had planned not violence, but courage. He picked up a small object from the table. The room leaned, a pair of scissors, metal dulled by earth. They struggled, he said. She cut one of them, not badly, but enough to make them afraid. No one spoke. They panicked, Purbright said. They struck her with what was to hand. He tapped the scissors lightly on the wood. That was not meant to kill her either. The silence grew thicker. They wrapped her, he said. Clumsily. In the parcel you have all imagined but not described. They buried her badly behind her own shop, where the ground was already disturbed by other small decisions. Mrs. Clout made a sound that was not quite a sound. The careful man, Purbright said, was sent to collect the parcel she had intended to deliver. Not cloth, not tools, her notes, her stitched-together knowledge. He looked directly at Blenkinsop. You found the ribbon, he said. Not because you were guilty, but because you were afraid. Blenkinsop nodded once, very small. The scarlet thread, Purbright said, and turned slightly toward Mrs. Clout, was not a threat. He smiled faintly. It was a marker. Mrs. Clout stared. She left it, Purbright said. The last time she came to the hall, it was her way of saying, I have begun to unravel something and I cannot stop. The room seemed to breathe again. The earth behind her shop was softened by rain, he said, by habit, by neglect. He looked at Fletcher. You will send men there, he said. Gently. Fletcher nodded. No one moved. They are not monsters, Purbright said quietly. They are men who preferred quiet to truth, and a town which preferred draws to daylight. He stepped back from the table. I shall not ask anyone to confess, he said. The ground will speak what it has held, and that will be sufficient. The chairs scraped, not in protest, but in instinct. Blenkinsop sat very still. Mrs. Clout folded and unfolded her handkerchief. Miss Tolland looked suddenly older. Outside, the square continued its business. A cart passed. A bird moved along the gutter with the careful dignity of something that knew its place. Behind the seamstress's shop, the disturbed earth waited. By late afternoon, men with shovels would find what sheathed lies surrender to. By evening, truths would be carried on stretchers, not whispers. Purbright walked alone from the reading room, pausing only once to look back. He thought of scarlet thread, of dull claret ribbon, of scissors that had cut for the right reason too late. And he knew that Needleford, having been forced into daylight, would now have to learn the delicate art of shadow all over again. By evening, Needleford had returned to its preferred arrangement of normality, which consisted mainly of not looking directly at anything that had recently been unearthed. The air smelt of damp soil and civic reassurance. Windows were opened a cautious inch wider, as though allowing in fresh oxygen and letting out old thoughts. The men who had dug behind the seamstress's shop worked with a respect usually reserved for churchyards, and stopped when told, which in Needleford was taken as a sign of virtue. Inspector Purbright stood at a distance that was neither kind nor theatrical. He did not look into the ground. He did not need to. He had seen this part of the business many times and had yet to find it improved by close inspection. Sergeant Fletcher approached him with the hesitant tread of a man who was learning that silence did not always mean safety. She was there, Fletcher said quietly. Yes, Purbright replied. They found, Fletcher began. Yes, Purbright said again, and this time it was not an answer. By dusk the whisper had travelled. Not loudly, because the town still fancied itself decent, but thoroughly, which was more damaging. Curtains twitched with renewed energy. Teacups were lifted and set down with small, undecided tremors. The butcher gave away a joint he could not bear to weigh. In the hall, Mrs. Clout sat with the second drawer open, looking at the short length of scarlet thread as if it had become suddenly elderly. She touched it once, very lightly, then closed the drawer with a sound no one else heard. She told herself that she had always meant to move it, and was troubled by how easily that might have been true. Councillor Blenkinsop did not leave his house. He sat in his chair and looked at the second drawer of his writing table until it seemed to be looking back. At last, he opened it. The ribbon lay inside, obedient and quiet. He lifted it between finger and thumb, and for the first time in many years allowed himself to remember that he had once signed papers without understanding them, and understood them later without admitting it. He folded the ribbon and placed it back, as one folds a letter that can never be sent. Miss Tolland walked to the canal and stood on the bridge, in her best coat. She had dressed as if for a funeral, though no one had invited her to one. She felt vindicated in a way that did not sit comfortably. She told herself she had only ever watched and never interfered, and was surprised by how thin that comfort felt when spoken silently. At the station, Purbright returned to his desk and picked up his pen. He wrote nothing of sentiment. He wrote no judgment of persons. He recorded only what had been found, where it had been found, and when. The paper accepted this without complaint. Paper was good at holding things that people could not. He paused once and then added a line of description that was unnecessary but accurate. He wrote that the deceased had been carefully wrapped, clumsily buried, and left in a place that suggested not hatred, but shame. Outside, the town breathed with a small, awkward rhythm. A child ran past, was called back, and walked after that. A dog lay down on a doorstep and refused to be philosophical. The vicar practiced a sermon about mercy and privately wondered if it would taste false. Later, Purbright walked through the square. He noticed that people were looking at the ground more often now, as if earth itself had acquired a reputation. He thought of Miss Harcourt sitting in her shop, sewing seams so straight that people trusted her hands more than their own. He thought of the meetings she had overheard, the figures she had glimpsed while cuffs were being adjusted, the moment she had decided that quietness, once useful, had become a form of cruelty. He did not think of her as brave, he thought of her as precise. That night, at his own table, he ate a simple supper that did not invite memory. He washed his cup and saucer himself, as he sometimes did, after matters that had unbalanced the air. He opened a drawer in his own sideboard and looked at letters he had never answered, and objects he had never thrown away. He closed it again, understanding dimly that he was not much better than the town he served, only more careful about it. Before bed, he took out the small notebook he never showed Fletcher. In it he wrote no facts, only observations. He wrote that towns were like garments, and that when they were cut badly, they did not fall apart at once, but wore their damage quietly until someone with the right eyes noticed the strain. He wrote that it was rarely the loud crimes that frightened him, but the careful ones, because carefulness implied practice. Purbright returned to his desk. He sharpened his pencil. He arranged the reports in neat piles. He answered letters that had nothing to do with blood, or thread, or frightened men. By midday, Needleford was officially itself again. In the quiet of the afternoon, he thought once more of the scarlet thread, not as a warning, and not as a clue, but as a small, stubborn line that refused to be invisible once it had been shown. He thought that perhaps this was the best one could hope for in a town like Needleford, where virtue was measured in inches and truth in whispers. He folded away the final paper. He placed his pen straight. He looked out of the window at a street that had arranged itself once more into innocence. And, as always after such matters, he returned to the slow comfort of quiet paperwork, carrying with him the knowledge that the town's seams, though restitched, would never again quite sit as smoothly as they pretended.